Hi, everybody. Thanks for showing up, both panelists and our Zoom audience, to the last panel of the day, Speculative Los Angeles. And thank you to the organizers of LitFest for having us. I'm going to give just a really brief description of our panelists first before we jet off into the future. Lynell George is an award-winning journalist and essayist whose work has appeared in Vibe, Essence, Smithsonian, and the LA Times, where she was a long-time staff writer whose work you probably have read. She is the author of No Crystal Stare, African Americans in the City of Angels, and After Image, Los Angeles Outside the Frame. Her latest book is A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky, The World That Made Octavia E. Butler. And Octavia Butler is one of our wonderful homegrown science fiction speculative writers. All right, Kathleen Kaufman is a longtime resident of Los Angeles, author of The Tree Museum, Hag, Diablo, The Lair. Okay, help me with this, Kathleen.
Laird Baylor. None of
Laird Baylor.
Titles are pronounceable.
Is that Gaelic? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Soon to be a feature film with Echo Lake Studios. Kaufman is a monster enthusiast and Olympic-level insomniac. When not writing, she can be found teaching literature and writing at Santa Monica College. She lives in LA with her husband, son, terrier, and a pack of cats. Duane Swierczynski, as I call you because your last name is too long for me, is a two-time Edgar Award-nominated author of 10 novels, including Revolver, Canary, and the Seamus Award-winning Charlie Hardy series, many of which are in development for film and TV. He has also written over 250 comic books featuring The Punisher, Deadpool, Judge Dredd, and Godzilla, among other noteworthy literary figures. A native Philadelphian, he now lives in LA with his family. All right, so welcome everybody. And let's talk a little about speculative fiction and Los Angeles. So Lynell, I want to start with you and just ask you, you wrote this book about Octavia Butler. You did a huge amount of studying and reading in the stacks at the Huntington Library. And were you interested in speculative fiction before you took on this book, or is it something that came as you studied her? And did her work and kind of, reading it very closely have any influence on your own short story that you wrote for Speculative Los Angeles, which is set in Echo Park?
Okay, I'm going to keep all of that in my head.
I'll prompt you.
Thank you. And thank you all. I'm so glad we're together, in this first days. Speculative fiction. I grew up, I'm a huge reader from a young age. And I think the first science fiction, speculative fiction that I can remember reading was probably Ray Bradbury, as a kid, and especially sort of glommed on to like his local LA story, and took science. When I was in junior high, there's a science fiction and fantasy class that I took.
Wow,
Mr. Grove, I see Mr. Grove now. But I was more like, on the poetry path and the, short fiction path, and wasn't even thinking about journalism. So fast forward to me ending up in the archive at the Huntington, that had to do with the journalism part of me and trying to write this posthumous interview about Octavia Butler for Clock Shop and their Radio Imagination series program in 2016, which was a way to pay homage to Butler, who that would have been it was 10 years since she had died, and we were doing this programming. So that, and I was coming at her in a different way, and so as I say to people, I didn't want to do a seance with Butler, but in a way, being in those papers, you're traveling through time in ways like one day you meet her and she's 7, and another day you meet her and she's, 40, and and just kind of seeing all the different people she can be. So I was really more focused on her life, her arc. My short story, I would say, really did come from the journalism part of me, and that, as you know, Denise, is like, when you're in a newsroom and their story is happening, there's the day 1 story, the day 2 story, the day 5 story, a month down the road, then the big story. And the one thing about being in the Butler archive, I kept thinking about something that she kept saying to younger writers and to journalists as well. I always ask, what if this goes on? And she said, and that's what most speculative fiction writers and science fiction writers do. They start there. And of course, it's not going to be the same thing. It's going to go off in some way. But it was a place to start. And so that's where I started with, what are the things that are concerning me about Los Angeles? And what might Los Angeles turn into if we don't stop? So in that way, I thought about Butler.
Yeah, so not with a scream, but a whimper. Kind of a very slow kind of de-evolution, dissolving. And just to mention some of the things in your story, the beaches and the canyons are sealed off. Only the wealthy can live there. There are no private cars anymore, even for the wealthy, I think, right? Or probably. And people are living in these little cohab slips that are extremely precarious. You never know when you're going to get evicted. And society is just breaking down in many large and small ways. And it's much hotter. It's 100 degrees year round. And your character is moving through this kind of burnt out landscape and questioning what the future will hold and her relationship will hold, and what is memory, what is the purpose of memory. She's a memory, what is it again? A memory coach?
Coach, yes.
Yeah, and she's trying to figure out her own memory. So there's something, I don't know, very Bradburian about it, shall we say?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, it's so that is certainly one take on what the future holds for Los Angeles, a very kind of dystopic, slow fade. Kathleen, your story, you've leapfrogged all over that, and we are in the 50 years from now or something, right? And even though you have monsters, there's no monsters in your story. There are robots, right?
Right. And they're actually quite nice too. I didn't make anything that scary in my story, really. Just out of character for me, quite, to be frank.
Well, I think that the go-to AI or robot story is robots running amok and destroying humanity. So it was so interesting that you kind of picked a very different role for your robot. Can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Sure. I think one of my big influences in just writing in general, as Lynell mentioned, was Ray Bradbury, and always has been. And there's this absolutely gorgeous short story that I teach every year too, August 2026. And it's the story of this house, this incredibly automated and beautifully envisioned house that he wrote in 1950, where these things kind of exist now. It's creepy. And
smart house.
Yeah, right. Envisioned in 1950, but all the humans are gone, and this very benevolent, very efficient house is just running itself, and it's just going through its job. And it's a very quiet story, and the technology and the AI is just benevolently functioning with or without humans. And I think that was in my head when I wrote Sailing. The idea that our technology doesn't have to run amok, it doesn't have to turn on us and become evil. It can actually be our legacy, and it can actually lead us into a future of peace and calm and prosperity in a way that we don't know now, a kind of quiet ending.
But it's a very different LA. The waves are lapping at the ground floors of the Century City towers because global warming and rising sea levels. The Century City is now the beach, and there has been a terrible pandemic in your story that has destroyed most of humanity. But it was a measles pandemic in your story. Oh, by the way, so for those of you listening, Kathleen's story was written before COVID, right?
Right.
Yeah. So what was it that made you think of a looming pandemic?
Remember back when we thought measles was going to be the problem? Quaint, right?
Yeah.
What we didn't know then. Well, I think the idea of environmental issues, I found it so interesting that environmental issues were so widespread throughout the collection. It's impossible, I think, to speculate about the future of LA without taking that into consideration. And my story does the same thing. I mean, the ocean levels have risen in my story to the point to where, the oceanfront property is now up to Century City. And the idea of a pandemic, it's inevitable, obviously. And it really is up to us as to how widespread and how virulent it is. And back in the day, I mean, back when I wrote this story, it was the cases of measles that were popping up from airports and being transmitted in public places. That was the big scary, and it made its way in to this story, which I realized after the last year and a half that my story was either going to be very prophetic or very unprofitable. It was going to be no and middle ground on that.
Well, I'm glad that our pandemic did not quite have the fatalities that yours did in fiction, but it's certainly, it's a wonderful story, but it also functions as a kind of a warning, of what the future could hold. Duane, your story has such a strong emotional sense, the father and the daughter, the characters, and yet it's also kind of a social satire. It's you've managed to for it to be extremely sincere and also to be kind of a critique of what the future might hold with our worship of celebrity. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, and also how you decided to structure it as a kind of the story is structured not traditionally, but as an interview with a detective.
Right. Yeah, it's sort of I wrote it. It's funny. All these stories about the future we wrote in the past. I mean, for me, it feels like it was forever ago. So one of the inspirations was there was a certain world leader of a democracy at one point who I was only fond of. I kind of thought maybe he was psychotic and really stupid and was leading us down a path that was pretty awful. And I thought, wow, what if we all concentrated really hard? Could we make his head explode like in Scanners? Could that happen maybe and save us all? And
Scanners, yes, of course.
But that never happened. But I just thought, what if that were possible? And if that were possible, the next step, of course, is you could actually think of anyone who's famous and take them out, right? If you had enough, people gathered up to do psychic stuff. And I thought, wow, okay, that's the opposite of LA, right? Everyone here feels like he's either famous at some level or wants to reach that level. I mean, I live in an apartment building. I'm surrounded by YouTubers and influencers, and I swear I recognize, bit players in different movies and TV shows. And it's kind of surreal. It feels like you're living on a backlot somewhere. I personally hate it. I thought I don't want to be famous. I don't want to be anywhere near fame. Like I don't want to be. In fact, this is not even me. This is a mask I'm wearing. The real me is. No, I'm kidding. It's me, sadly. But the idea of fame horrifies me. So I thought, what if the script was flipped a bit and it was suddenly, if you were famous, you were on someone's hit list. And it kind of went from there, kind of imagining, just like Lynell said, Kathleen, what's the kind of next step? Where does that, that situation take you? What's the natural conclusion? And at some point you have a bunch of D-listers hiding out for their lives while these, psychic death cults try to take them out. So that was the heartwarming, part of the story, I guess, right? No, the father-daughter stuff, funny you mentioned, was, based on from my own life. so that was, I was going through a tough time. It was funny when we first met. It was before my life went kind of crazy, and I started writing it right after life went, kind of haywire, and it was very therapeutic. It was like, okay, the reason I kind of chose dialogue was I think I was incapable at the moment of writing actual prose, and dialogue was for some reason felt easier and more honest. Like just get characters talking, and I really thought I'd maybe fill in some stuff later, make it a proper story, but I don't know, the dialogue took over and it became kind of their voices for me became like how they came to life. And I didn't want to mess with that. I was crossing my fingers, you and say, hey, Duane, how about some description maybe? Maybe some, I don't know, scene setting. So I was glad you didn't think it was weird.
No, I thought it, and I also thought it was a really great break from the other stories that were all prose. I think it delivered something that was extremely immediate, and there was an interrogatory tone to the prose, which I really appreciated. And I felt like I was very grounded in place. Tell us about the Hollywood that this is set in. It's not the Hollywood of today, is it?
No, it's Hollywood, I guess, in the near future, where the Walk of Fame, where all the tourists go. You have all the hot spots, the Chinese theater, you have Musso and Frank, the restaurant down the street, and Scientology is right there. So I thought all these places, like just when a few blocks from each other, like what does it look like when the world stops caring about famous people, or the world doesn't want to be famous? What happens to the Walk of Fame, literally. So I spent a lot of time on that strip because I go to the Egyptian theater back when we go to theaters and see movies a lot. I just loved it. I think it's just kind of wonderful. It's kind of a weird kind of bit of time travel almost. You can almost squint and see like what it used to be like, maybe. I think I don't know, for me, place is so important to the story. Once I know the place, I can kind of dig my brain in a little bit and figure it out. And I love the other stories like Lynell Echo Park. It's like I can see everything. Feeling so like cut off from the ocean, cut off from everything else. It was just wonderful, And Kathleen, I love that you buried Fox. That's awesome. It's underwater. Kudos. That's great. No, but I think this anthology, I really do love it because every story is a different port into some part of this city, this wonderful city that I'm still learning and still kind of falling in love with. So the sense of place to me is like so huge. Even when you're doing speculative stories, if it's not grounded somewhere, it's kind of I'm not a big fan of honestly of stories that are set in imaginary planets and fantasy worlds. I don't think my brain can't quite hook onto it. I love stories in a ruined earth. Places I know.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's big piles of rubble everywhere. There's no-go zones, and I like the fact that the psychic death cults that meet in these abandoned, boarded up, desolate movie theaters, that, even though the celebrities can be in Malibu on Broad Beach or up in Bel Air, they can't hide from these folks because these folks are psychic. And so they don't actually have to breach the fortress walls. Their heads can explode right on Broad Beach. So I think that, I know that reading that story, I was impressed by how much pop culture, and kind of comics and, horror movies and everything you kind of wove into the woof and warp of your story, like, Scanners. The idea of people's heads blowing off. And I love that kind of high-low thing where you're able to mix, kind of traditional sci-fi with, the pop culture and the stuff we all grew up with and love. And that was maybe, at one point considered, kind of low pop culture, like, this isn't serious stuff. But you made it very serious. With your character.
So happy to hear that. I think I live in low pop land, honestly, and that's why I love that stuff. So, if I escape somehow and get fancy, great. But that's sort of it is. A lot of the inspiration was going to like all night movie marathons at like the New Beverly Theater, and and it was like at one point I attended an Arnold Schwarzenegger all night film festival. The hope was that somehow all 200 of us would conjure the former governor somehow, and he'd come up and say, "Hi, hey, thank you." He never did, but it was kind of a fun thing to think, oh, maybe he'll show up, and I don't know, that kind of obsessive, and everyone in the theater, people go there are super obsessed about film and know everything. I'm like, I know nothing, but these guys know everything. And I just thought that was kind of fun and kind of a neat world to play in. Like if you're that focused on, these famous people and know everything about them, it's a little scary.
I didn't mean to say that, you should aspire to, high culture. What I meant was that I felt that the emotions between the father and the daughter were extremely, they really grabbed me. There was something extremely realistic about them. There was nothing kind of ersatz and comic booky about that part of it. Which,
yeah, and that, not to, I think I'm talking so much, sorry. It's the, at the time, Denise, this, and maybe you guys don't know this, we lost our daughter 2.5 years ago to leukemia. She was 15. That's her. That's very much her in that story. That was me just trying to recapture, a bit of that conversation. And that's who she was, kind of a wise ass. Very funny, terribly funny, awesome. So that was the story was kind of what the first thing I kind of wrote coming out of that. It was my brain was nuked. I was like, what can I do? And I just want to talk to my daughter. I think it's kind of the appeal of that story. That's kind of where it came from. So, living in the gutter, but also, having a conversation.
Yeah. Well, I think it worked on so many levels. I want to ask you guys too about, what role LA plays and its people and its geography in terms of inspiring your fiction in general. Whoever wants to jump in can. Kathleen, I know you've had stories and novels that are set on the West Side, like Mar Vista, right?
Yeah, I think LA is so interesting because it has a little bit of everybody in it, and I have. Yes, my novels have been set in my trilogy that finishes its way out here in August 2021. Starts its role in Venice, and I've always found the West Side Venice area really interesting in that there is just a little bit of everybody there, and you can be anybody you want here in a weird way. My husband and I went to a Game of Thrones cosplay party. We were
awesome.
That's cool.
But we were walking down.
You would have enjoyed that.
Full on wildling gear with a fake sword and everything, and nobody even looked at us. Nobody even glanced. Nobody thought it was weird. The security guard in the parking garage was like, "Yeah, they're fine, whatever." Bigger fish to fry. But you can do that in LA, and I like that about this city. So I think when it comes to things like speculative writing and fiction, it's a really interesting landscape for it.
Well, what you're saying is that LA is already, and the people who live here are already so half speculative and living their own fantasies or trying to visualize and enact their own fantasies. And the landscape is so stark, the fires, the earthquakes, it's kind of this Old Testament land of plagues and so how do you tackle speculative fiction when you're already living in a place that is half speculative without even going there? I mean, Lynell, what about you? What do you think? What did Octavia do? I mean,
it's funny. Well, as you were talking, I was thinking about, when I was starting in journalism, in the early 90s, and there was all this stuff going on, riots and fires and OJ and earthquakes, and I had gotten a job offer to go back east, and I thought, I'm here now to write about this. And I know people were thinking, it's crazy, you have a chance to go away from this. Why do you want to run into the burning house? But
you're a writer. That's
I'm
why.
a writer.
Yeah.
Why?
Gotta chronicle it, document
it. And to answer your question about Octavia, she saw all that too, and she wasn't particularly fond of LA. That was the interesting thing to learn, even though absolutely used the backdrop, climate change, distances. She created maps. Oftentimes, before she started writing. So I love that you did this, that these books do have maps, because it reminded me of the way she would work. She wanted to see space, but also how she put people together. So Kathleen, what you were speaking about, like this idea of who are we with and how do we come together as community? But Los Angeles frustrated her, and so she was, a lot of the stuff she's worked out in her journals and sometimes in her stories. And I feel that way too. I would tell people who, would arrive here and become immediately frustrated with LA and hate it. And, and I've gone through my bouts with my feelings about the city. And I said, Los Angeles really requires you to be a participant in creating the city you want. And you can stitch it together, from different little communities that you make, but you can't be a wallflower. You have to if you want to make this work for you, you have to write your own city. And that's what I feel, I'm constantly doing here just in my regular life, and as well as on the page.
That's a great point. It is sort of like LA. It's a giant, vast, say, salad bar.
Yes.
You live in the crouton dish, fine, but that's boring, right? You want to kind of venture out and kind of make your own salad from all these wonderful elements. It's the truth, Some people do want to live in their little crouton bowl. That's fine, but I just, it's so much richer for, oddly enough, this pandemic year, I've done a lot of Sunday morning, kind of just driving around, looking at different areas, just because there's no traffic. It's great. Right. And I've learned so much about the city just by being in different places, and being unafraid. People who people who are anti-LA, they were so afraid, I can't do the whole thing. You're not supposed to. You're not supposed to.
It makes you crazy. Right?
That's why I really like the format of the Speculative Los Angeles anthology, because I didn't mention that every author picked a different neighborhood to set their speculative fiction story in. So we don't have 14 stories about Hollywood or about the beach or downtown or, the wealthy West Side. And we don't have 14 stories about the big one hitting. We have one, an excellent one by Luis Rodriguez.
Mm-hmm.
But so it is the future, whether dystopia. Well, yeah, they're all pretty dystopic, I have to say. Kathleen, yours is dystopic in a very different way. I'm not going to give it away, but you talked about all that peace and calm, but it really is a dirge as well. And that's why I put it last, because I just thought we're sailing away with Kathleen's story. But it is true that I think, so everyone picked the neighborhood they wanted to write about. And Duane, you were the only one who wanted to write about Hollywood. You were surprised about that.
I was.
But
I thought I had to fight someone for it. I'm like, no.
No, because I think, you were the perfect guy to write that story. But I just think people were also interested in exploring other areas. And so many parts of LA are so different from each other, the different suburbs, the different neighborhoods, the different ethnic communities.
Oh, yeah.
And, so it's really great that there is a total mix of stories, from myth to, demons to, hard dystopia to softer dystopia. Lynell, your story also reminds me a little bit of William Gibson's latest trilogy that he's writing, Agency, and I forget what the other one was, where there was something...
Peripheral.
The Peripheral, right. And then the third one, I think he's still writing, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And in that, I don't know if you've read them, but in that trilogy, there's something called the jackpot, which is kind of like the really bad thing that happens, except it's not something that happens overnight. It is a very slow drip of bad things that lead to other bad things. And so his world is kind of a little bit like the world that you posited in your story, where it's not like one horrible thing that happens. And I think that in your story, what's really great is that even though the future is kind of unknown and everyone is grappling with just kind of survival, that here's this one young woman who is also trying to piece together the past. And I think for her, it's like, is this real, the past that I recall? Really, was I ever able to get to the beach? Did I once live at the beach? Or is that a fantasy that I've created? I mean, she begins to doubt herself.
Right.
So that was fascinating to me. So in terms of LA inspiring you guys, what about like the city's myths and the city's geography? Did that play a role in kind of getting at the essence of your stories?
I think so. I mean, definitely. What strikes me about LA is that how vertical it is. I grew up in Philadelphia. It's a little more flat, this area. And I was just always sort of astounded by how, it's only a mile this direction, but you're not taking into account the hill, the mountain you have to kind of go over, and the winding road. And it's like, what is this? I'm kind of always fascinated by just the landscape. And I think, honestly, if you asked me today to write a story, I would choose a much different area for that reason. Something kind of just weirder, because I've done more exploring, and it's like, wow, okay, how do people want to live here, and B, actually manage to live here, in certain corners of the city that just seems so precarious. And with fires, obviously, our first month here, there's a big fire in Santa Clarita, and the sky was half brilliant, beautiful blue and half purple, like a bruise. It was like this from the wildfire smoke. I'm like, what? Where did I move my family to? And that to me is, just sort of fascinating. And Lynell, your story really hit home with me as far as because about being kind of like cut off from everything that makes this place, that connects us all. And not only after I read your story, I drove to Laguna Beach just to see it. Never been there. And it felt so unwelcoming. I'm not knocking Laguna Beach as far as resident. It's just more like it's so walled off in a way. It's like all these things are built to prevent access to what should be accessible to all. And it just felt. So your story was like, wow, yeah. I mean, you have a mirror up on Kern LA, and you're tilting it to that's down the road, not too far. I can see that in LA, sadly, happening. So your story is wonderful. But and Kathleen, yours as well. I mean, yours is like a kind of really peaceful. It's the last person to turn the lights out, right, on LA. It's kind of well, sorry, fuck, I just did that, didn't I? I just cursed too.
We're just gonna glide on past that, Duane.
But
keep going.
It was a beautiful, and I kind of think, okay, that's the LA, maybe the end that we deserve, and kind of maybe you're lucky enough to have. I don't know. It was just I was impressed by the beauty of the stories, and not so much the space opera angles. I mean, I kind of felt like I was the junking things up with my scanners and my head exploding stuff. You guys all had really thoughtful, beautiful, poems to this wonderful area.
Well, I think the idea was that we would have 14 different points of view and perspectives. And so we needed you just as much as we needed the sailing story and the walled off story. And Lynell, with your story, I just kept thinking of, those parts of Malibu where the Billionaires Row is that are blocked off, right? And each summer, some, open equal beach access people lead like a big walk, and they plant the flag in front of all the billionaire houses, and the private security tries to chase them away. And they're armed with like the California codes that say we are allowed to be here at the low tide mark or whatever it is.
Right.
And so in a way, your story is just kind of saying, what if, just like Octavia said, what if it was just a little bit worse? Right. What if it was a little bit worse?
And it's funny, and I feel this way about how we've watched so much change happen around us, and we have to keep pivoting, and we're not thinking about how the larger canvas is changing necessarily. And it's interesting, Duane, when you're talking about going out and driving and looking at things, because I've been thinking too, what is the LA we're going to inhabit after COVID is, well, I don't know, over whenever we can actually, what is it going to look like? I had to go for a complicated car repair reason. I had to go drive around for a while. And I was driving around and I was stunned. I thought I had been out recently, but I hadn't. There's certain stretches and so much was boarded up. And of course it was, a lot of it was the mom and pop stores, but some of it were big things. And then I found, again, lost in my own city. Here I am in Los Angeles. These are streets I've driven my entire life. I'm a native, but the touchstones are gone. The things that defined, place for me are gone, and change happens everywhere. And it's always has felt sped up here. And now it feels even more sped up. And, so what is the backdrop going to look like? And we all seem to try to figure out some way to live around all that change, and whatever that future will be. I think, we're hardy in that way. But so here's my main character who, I named her after a freeway off ramp and on ramp, because
tell us the name.
Alondra.
I love that.
Every time I'm in the car, you're always hearing about, there's traffic stuck at the Alondra off ramp, and there's now you'll hear it all the time too. It was like all the time I'm thinking, I'm naming her Alondra, because here's this woman who is trying to get her bearings, in this place and find her place. And the city is always talking to me and kind of begging me to tell I think I'm done with this, but then it's like, no, now I have to tell this chapter of the story.
Wow. Actually, Denise, ask you about your story. It kind of looks a different direction than a lot of the stories, which is great. Kind of more mythic. I mean, where did your story come from? What spoke to you?
That story has been in my head for the longest time. I do a lot of trail running in the Santa Monica Mountains, and I've always wished there were a bar like that, like the old bar tucked away, like underneath a sandstone cliff somewhere off some remote trail where time kind of eddied and spun in strange ways, and you could kind of pierce the veil of different times and places. Well, all of it Los Angeles, but so that was kind of the impetus for it. And I just find the Santa Monicas to be kind of a magical place. And you can be like in some of these canyons at very remote places where if it weren't for, the contrails and the jets and, you could feel that it was 250 years ago. Yeah. So, and then I just think of our shameful genocide of the Native Americans and just how horrible the Spanish mission system was to the Native Americans. And so it just kind of coalesced around that. And then Me Too was happening. So that also had kind of a role. And I just, I just feel I'm fascinated by that whole world, and it is very sad to me that there are so few Native Americans from this area that we know by name. One of them is this woman named Toi Purina, who was a woman who led the only known and commemorated revolt against Spanish rule in the late 1700s. Maybe that was the only one. Maybe it was just because it was a woman. It was so odd to the Spaniards that they wrote it down. But so much of that history has been lost, and it's always fascinated me. And I've done deep reading into like early LA histories, chronicles of what people found here when they first arrived. Under the mission system and before and after, and the Californios and all that. So I don't know. I just think there's a lot of stuff to unearth about that. I've talked to your publisher, Patty Calistro, about that.
Okay.
Yeah, just kind of in general, over cocktails. But it's like, there's so much there. There's so much in the archives. So mine kind of looked back as well as kind of looking into the present. And also the first story in the collection by Lisa Morton, the setup is a Los Angeles that California never became part of the United States. It's an alternate history story, and stayed agricultural. And what I love is that the two women who run the Rancho Luis are a Native American woman and a Hispanic woman. And that causes some friction with the Hispanic woman's brother, who thinks that because he's a man, he should be running the ranch. But anyway, it's I love that story. It was a good way to begin, I thought. I've been also reading some histories of Los Angeles in film. People say, I think people have counted up the movie has been destroyed in apocalyptic scenarios, and there's almost 100 movies which, LA gets hit by the big one, LA gets hit by a tidal wave, LA is destroyed in a nuclear explosion. And the reality is all of those things, but also different, with the fires,
Right.
for example.
Yeah.
And I just feel like we all live on the edge of the continent, and we live in such a precarious place that it infuses all our writing with this kind of sense of dread and anxiety, like, well, the forest fire could hit my house next, or, the big one.
Yeah, completely.
Should I be buying earthquake insurance? Can I even get earthquake insurance? Is there such a thing anymore? And Octavia Butler's stories, it was so great because she had a freeway, the 5 freeway, that there are no cars anymore because there's no fossil fuel.
Right.
And so she has people like these migrants, these like groups, these little groups of pilgrims, like on the freeway, traveling in groups to be safe, to try to find shelter and start a community somewhere. Or they've heard, there's no communication anymore, there's no internet. So that they've heard that, there is a community somewhere in Northern California, and if they could just get there. But of course, the highway, or the literal highway, which is now just a road, is lined with all sorts of predators and gangsters, and it's so apocalyptic, and yet it's LA. It's the 5 freeway that we drive along every day.
But then the imagery in that too, where again, she's, we see, these encampments and the homeless. And I was thinking about her a lot when Echo Park was cleared,
Yes.
and I was, and I was thinking about how she described the encampments and how people were living and how they were dressed and how they were, and that idea too, that the park has been cleared and, the people are being put up, but, places, however, many of them don't want to be there. And so that tension exists in her novel as well, in the parable.
Well, it also is in your story. I mean, you talk
Yes.
about the homeless encampments too.
Yes.
And, that could have been today. That could have been, a month ago with Echo Park. And especially what was haunting was your description of one of the women.
Yes.
The homeless women.
Yeah.
And can you just describe that for us a little bit?
Yes. And how some of them were dressing in more clothing and, trying to cover their heads, and so that they looked, you couldn't tell what their gender was. Maybe they would think that they were men, or they didn't tell, so that they could just be more invisible and not be attacked. And it was their way of being safe in an extremely unsafe situation.
Of course, that's already happening here.
Yeah.
I mean, I have read interviews with women who are living on the street, and that is a reality and a danger that they already face.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, it kind of makes you long for Kathleen's world, where everything is pretty. And,
Well, it's calm. It's coming out of a place that wasn't very pretty, right? But now it's just kind of quiet. Maybe
talk a little bit about how the overlords have tried to recreate some aspects of humanity, because I found that fascinating. Like the pier and the amusement park that the character looks out on from her high rise in Century City.
I love the idea that the bots that are AI that we have created that have become sentient would be also sentimental. That would be part of the programming that maybe we developed, or maybe has developed within their systems, that is something, like I said, our legacy. I love the idea that they would be sentimental and want to have a recreation of these things that were really iconic landmarks of LA, like the pier. Or like in the story, the bots have archived all of the art and books and paintings, and are taking care of them in such a way that they will last forever, even though there's not going to be any more humans to appreciate them, perhaps. But the idea that they saw the value in it, even though they couldn't maybe process it in the same way as a human would, so that it would still last indefinitely for whatever might come towards the planet or towards whatever life form might be coming to see it next.
Yeah, just really food for thought in that story. And the cat, I love the cat.
Well, all my stories have cats or a dog in them somewhere, usually because they're jumping on my keyboard while I'm writing. themselves.
Demanding to be heard. Well, I think in some of the stories, perhaps, not yours, obviously, but in some very dystopic stories, there might be no more cats and dogs. They would all be eaten or who knows. Duane, I want you to have the last word in terms of like, where do you like Harlan Ellison, right? You've read some of his short stories, and of course his oh my God, his movies, that were made of his stories and his books, and also he wrote for Outer Limits and all that.
Right.
And I see you somehow as like following in that world. Do you see yourself as writing in his tradition?
Being like short and cranky, like Harlan Ellison? No, I adore. I honestly, I'm a huge fan. I adore his work. He's one of the writers that got me into the genre back in the day. Just is bizarre. In fact, it was thanks to Stephen King's his Danse Macabre, that book, a survey of all these writers. I mean, that's how I discovered Matheson, discovered Bradbury, oddly enough, and Harlan Ellison. So those stories were like, wow, this. To me, he taught me that science fiction doesn't have to be space opera, which you grew up thinking. You watch Star Wars, you watch all these things as a kid, but it's about people, and it's about people pushed to extremes and in weird situations, and it's all about being very human. So that, I mean, I think he was a very, a writer, very concerned about humanity, and so if I'm following in his tradition, that's great. It's wonderful. But I was encouraged to hear, Lynell and Kathleen talk about Bradbury, because that, he's huge, and I can't think of LA without Bradbury, and vice versa, right? He's he's like the original. He's fanboy prime. Like, he loved this town. He loved Hollywood. He just adored it. Like, it's infectious. I spent some time in Venice in the fall, and I was reading I guess his stories. His mystery novel set there.
Yes.
What's it? I'm blanking on the name of it. I love this book.
Murder is a Lonely Business.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. It was just so great that it was a snapshot of like the collapsing Venice Pier and how gothic it was and cool. And I mean, I don't know. I love writers who can grab my hand and take me along and do some time travel to a place like LA, and do that for me. So like Bradbury, Harlan Ellison, all those guys, who I think of as LA speculative writers, really did dig deep into this, this turf, and made me kind of fall for this place long before I even saw it the first time.
Well, I think that the time travel is an element that I feel is in all your stories and all of our lives, just stepping outside of LA. You've all talked about that like there's so many layers to excavate. I do believe we're out of time. I want to thank everybody who tuned in. I want to thank our wonderful panelists and all the LitFest organizers who put so much work into this. And I think we need to say goodbye now. Thank you for tuning in. Bye-bye, everybody.